So formally, welcome to Gather Around Local Food. This is a week of online events where we've been hearing about how we can demonstrate rural community resilience by localising our food and also shape a green economic recovery from the devastating impacts of COVID by better supporting our local farmers, growers, food makers and craftspeople. I'm Stuart Gushinsky from Forth Environment Link, and if you do like today's session, please follow Forth Environment Link's social media for news of more events coming up in the coming months from us as part of our Climate Action Network. And before I introduce our speakers, just a further reminder, we are being recorded today, just in case you're joining us a little bit late. And so you can catch up with us again or take your camera off if you prefer. Today we're delighted to welcome people who have a passion for growing food. Both have made it their mission to help get others growing, to help create an even more vibrant and resilient community in their areas. Growing your own food, perhaps together as a community, has so many incredible, wonderful benefits, from mental health to physical fitness, from gaining tangible skills to taking home nutritious, tasty, wholesome food. Ellie Banwell and Paula McDonald run Scrumptious Garden near the banks of Loch Tay and launched Killin Neighbour Food in the Forth Valley last spring, partly as a route to market for their own market garden produce, but they're also strong advocates of urban growing and even the smallest city plots, where they put food at the heart of everyday urban life and community. But first today we have Steve and Sean, I'm delighted to say, joining us from Sustainable Thinking Scotland. Steve and Sean have been supporting approximately 30 families a week by growing food for their local food bank to ensure that there's always a tasty, fresh fruit veg option for their local community. What's more, they're really keen to pass on their knowledge to encourage other people to take up their spades and start growing for themselves. Steve and Sean, perhaps I can ask you to kick off today's session by introducing yourselves and tell us a little bit more about the background of Sustainable Thinking Scotland, how it meets your own community needs and what your hopes are for its future development.
Yeah, thanks, Stuart. I've got a little presentation that will probably show everybody a little bit easier, so I'll just start that. There we go. So I'm Sean Kerr and this is Stephen McQueen, and we are Sustainable Thinking Scotland CIC, and we're based in the walled garden at Kinneil Estate. Our journey really started when we were picking up food for the local food poverty services as part of the Fair Share programme. Now, whilst the bakery goods and the tinned goods are fine, the food that we were picking up that was meant to be fresh produce unfortunately wasn't very good. It was already a day out of date when we were picking it up. It was then stored overnight and then we were using it in a 5-day food parcel. So it wasn't really fit for purpose. So we felt that there must be a better way to do this, to be able to grow the food locally and then give it straight in as soon as we can, as fresh as possible, trying to help increase the dietary requirements of those that are using the service. So in January 2017, we found a bit of a walled garden in Kinneil Estate and decided to start our STS Food Bank Farm project. Now, when we arrived on site, there was a lot of wood waste from pallets and other damage that had been done to the polytunnel that we were taking. So we decided that we would try and make everything that we could out of the wood waste that we had, as well as doing up the polytunnel, getting ourselves ready to start growing. We then had to bring in our own soil because we were making our own raised beds. We can't actually grow in the ground here. So we had to bring in our soil, test it, make sure it was ready for purpose, and then start growing food for the food bank. Managed to make our first donation that year in about June 2017, and then we went on to make a further 12 donations that year, allowing us basically to get the service up and running so that we could ensure that the timings were good for the food bank, because we pick it and deliver it to them on 9 o'clock on a Thursday, and then it's out to somebody else at about 10 o'clock. So again, trying to keep it as fresh as we possibly can. In year 2, we managed to increase the amount of beds that we had in the one polytunnel, as well as to plan out this growing season a little bit better. So we managed to make an increased amount of 23 donations in 2018. And as you can see, the amount of vegetables that we were donating increased quite a bit as well.
Alright, in year 3 we got our second polytunnel. That gave us space to do a teaching area before we put the cabins up. It gave us space to propagate seeds and to build more raised beds. In the third year we hit a total of 26 donations, further increasing the volume of food as well as delivering the food growing workshops for the community. We also got a dog in that time. Year 4, the COVID impact. The compound which we had taken over had 7 polytunnels. Until year 4, we only had the first 2. We probably wouldn't have moved everything so quickly to get the raised beds built and the new tunnels had it not been for these. Bowness alone went from approximately 20 families a week up to 80 families. So to have the space to make a dent in that, I just felt that we had to sort of put everything else aside and do that. So that's what we did. So we expanded the thing into the rest of the 7 polytunnels and 3 greenhouses. It was early in the season, so we were able to propagate all our seeds in the greenhouses and then plant them out into the tunnels as we were able to build the raised beds. This vastly increased our donations, so we're on 22 so far this year that we've put in, and that's ranged, or it's about 60 to 70 kilos of food we're putting in a week. I think we still need to maximise how it's used. We don't currently put it in soup packs or we've not got the system down quite yet. But the fact that the vegetables are going in is it's a big bonus for us. So we now donate to both the local food bank and food pantry, and with the expected unemployment figures by the end of October, we feel that the demand again is going to shoot up, and when you tie that in with Brexit, whether there's going to be food shortages, I think really the only sustainable way for food poverty to be solved is us doing it locally by ourselves. So that's where we are now. If there's any questions, I'd be happy to answer.
Thank you, guys. That's really fascinating. It's so great to see those pictures as well. It looks a bit like a comic strip on my screen. You can see the progression of the veg. Thanks so much for sharing that with us. Can you tell us a little bit about? Can you tell us a little bit about the 2 routes you have at the moment, the food bank and the food pantry? Tell us a little bit about the 2 different models there and how you work with them.
The food bank was set up many years ago, and the food pantry was just set up during COVID. It looks as though the food pantry is going to be the model that the local authorities are pushing. It looks as though that will include people will pay a £5 membership fee to join the food pantry and £3 every time they use it thereafter. Hopefully to bring some dignity to it.
It's not particularly the model that we would choose, but
yeah,
again, the normal system for people accessing the food bank is that you would be referred either by a GP, social worker or a school to the food bank, and you would receive a set amount of parcels each week. Typically for most nationalised food bank services it's 3 weeks. For some of the more private ones like the one that we deal with, they try and do 6, mostly because that lines up with the sanctions that you get if your universal credit is stopped. The food pantry system allows you to actually go into a place and select the food that you want, and then take that with you. the issue with that is that generally people don't have an idea of how some of the produce can be used, especially with the variety of stuff that we're donating in. As Steve was saying, we would probably like to move to a model where we can provide them with soup or a recipe pack or something easy that can show them what can be done with the produce once they've collected it, and hopefully encourage their choices.
I mean, I think another thing is maybe a once in a lifetime chance for us to put good, fresh vegetables into these people or into people's houses. When they had money, or a little money, whether they would choose to go out and buy this or to buy nutritious stuff, or whether it would just all be chicken nuggets or what it would be. So the opportunity that we have to put different things into people's houses to give them a taste of it or to give them ideas of what can be done. I think we've been working with Danny from Outside the Box a bit this year, who's been helping us with recipes to take in. I think with everyone being online now, I think digital workshops for cooking along with the packs that we're putting in could really be beneficial, as well as being nutritious but beneficial in getting people to cook with their kids. And if they can do it online or follow through, we just feel it's no-brainers.
Yeah, and from there it's quite an easy leap to try and take people into going straight to seed to plate rather than just missing the whole thing. And we do a lot of work with primary schools in the local area. We're trying to work with the high school now and to develop a little bit of stuff that they've got. They rather famously in Bowness had the Tesco's recipe that was national. So again, trying to work with them, as they also have a soup competition, to try and see if they can utilise the produce a little bit better on a different or dynamic way, so that we can try and engage people, whether that's through online or trying to get them up and rent a bed off us, just so that they can start practising on their own or volunteering with us to keep the rest of the farm going.
I think the fact that we have the space up here as well, that we can potentially socially distance well, and speaking to some of our volunteers, I think some people's confidence has dropped about being out in public or socialising, and I think a stepping stone to get these people back out and about and feeling themselves again, I think that could be beneficial. And I think anything that can help people that is also tied into food production at this time is going to be vital. I don't think there's going to be a particularly good budget in food production or food sustainability. So, but the problem will be there. So to try and be able to apply for funds for training or for other things that is going to allow us to produce more food is probably the way we're going to have to look at things coming up in the next year.
Can you tell us a little bit, you mentioned there about people possibly renting beds from you, so within the walled garden there, so they could come in and grow them. Is that something that you have plans for, or is something that's already happening? And
it was actually something we had planned for, but COVID had kind of put kibosh to that. We ended up using the rest of the space that we had to fold into the food bank farm to allow us to donate as much as we could. But in theory, the plan was, in the start of this growing season in March, that we would have at least 3 tunnels filled with 62 beds that we could use as community growing space. 18 of those were exclusively going to be used for the local primary schools, given the 6 of them 3 beds each. And again, trying to tie that in, whether it's with the kind of placement stuff or the high school learning, where they can give a little bit more knowledge whilst trying to gain some interpersonal skills themselves, or as Steve says, trying to bring the volunteers' confidence up to allow them to do stuff. We had previously taken one set of school pupils to another school, so again, seeing the confidence that they got helping and teaching the other pupils that they hadn't met before was something that we really liked. So again, trying to replicate that across the rest of the community and encourage as much community growing as possible. We've at least got an idea now and a blueprint of what you need to be able to get something like this up and running. So if there is other vacant and derelict sites, being able to try and encourage that is definitely something we need to do.
Yeah, I think in either the Community Empowerment Act or the Land Reformation Act, there was legislation put in place to say that for every X amount of people on the list for allotments, Y amount of allotments must be created. And again, pushing at the food poverty, it seems like if you can give people or communities the confidence to be able to go and grow it for themselves, then that's what that legislation's for, to empower the people to go out and do it themselves. But it's a big step to do it without any experience in doing so. So hopefully, I mean, we never had any experience in growing anything when we started here. We'd seen the problem and wanted to do something, as opposed to being skilled in the area and saying that we could do anything. So there has been a lot of trial and error. But as haphazard as that may seem sometimes, I think if people also haven't had that experience, it shows that it can be done without the experience. It's a case of going for it and doing your bit. And
yeah, failure's not the end of the game. It just means that you've got to try something a little bit different. So again, it all comes back to confidence and building the capacity to let the community do it for themselves.
It's a great story to tell, isn't it? That you started at the same level everybody, you know, other people might be at right now, but you've managed to find your path through it, make the mistakes, learn from them, and develop something, and you can pass that learning on through your community, and hopefully that will continue to ripple through. That learning will stay and be passed on. And not only that, you mentioned you've got that blueprint there where you can say to other communities, look, this is we found this space, this is what we did with that space, which is inspiring and incredible.
yeah, we have biochar that we're making now. I mean, the whole idea was for us to create a model that was completely self-sufficient, that could be put behind every food bank. The fact that anybody is going to Tesco's with their hand out, I mean, if it was great stuff they were getting, then I understand, but it tended not to be.
It's a food waste issue rather than a food poverty issue, which again isn't helpful if you're asking them to be the community champion.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm glad they did something when there's no other option. Then you'll eat that, but it just felt like he says, it's trying to solve food waste rather than solving good, nutritious, healthy food to the people that need it. I mean, people want us to sell our good, nutritious stuff and buy in less nutritious things and give that into the food bank. But the idea was not to outprice nutrition from people that need it. I think there were studies showing that bad nutrition can drop your IQ by 14 points. So it just seems nuts that you're trying to solve the problem of waste rather than creating a solution.
Absolutely, I think it's a really important point to make, that there are two distinct problems there, and they're not necessarily linked. Thank you, guys. I think we'll come back to you later for some more questions from everybody. But I'm gonna move on to Ellie now. Ellie and her partner Paula run Scrumptious Garden, and also the Killeen Neighbour Food in the north of Forth Valley. And I'll hand over to you to introduce yourself, Ellie, and let us know what you guys have been doing and what your plans are.
Okay. Can everyone hear me okay? And can you see the presentation okay? Good. Thumbs up from everyone. Good. Oh, let's go back to where I was. There we go. So I'm Ellie. Paula's not here today. And Scrumptious Garden is also a CIC. I'm going to focus today. We're coming to the end of our second year at this site. So you'll see the difference between a 2-year-old organisation and a 4-year-old organisation. And I'm focusing on the market garden that we're setting up in our rural site today. However, it is part of a larger urban growing plan for the business. And we are interested in and motivated by a lot of the same problems that we've just heard about. And we are maybe looking at it from the other end of the problem. So we're looking at whether we can create jobs for people growing food in cities. And so the model that we are currently setting up in a rural location is designed ultimately to be transferable into those areas of vacant and derelict land that we were just hearing about. We have some partnerships with housing associations, which we're finding is a really good match-up for us. They tend to have quite a lot of just little patches of land that isn't being used productively, is often in quite good condition actually. And the idea of our business model is that we can take what would be very small areas of land that wouldn't on their own be viable and join them up into these patchwork of tiny little modular market gardens that together make something that is financially self-sustaining. And we are a community interest company, not because we don't want the business to be profitable or at least break even, we do, but we don't want to generate a surplus. And being a community interest company enables us to put all of our revenue into paying people a living wage and use that to try and keep our prices down, rather than having to generate a surplus and that's how you pay the directors or however we might otherwise run it. But we do ultimately plan for this business to be a business rather than you know, an ethical first, business second. It is ethical business with equal priority. So as I said, we're only just in our 2nd year. And so I've called this the cutting room floor because I didn't want to just show you the aerial. I wanted to show you the struggle. We also don't have any experience. We came to this with no money. And so I wanted to show, you know, this is real. This is what it takes to set up a market garden from not very much. So I'll start with the future. So at the moment, we have a field that is about 1 hectare, which is 2.5 acres. It's a fairly decent sized field, it's quite big. And ultimately, what we want is a market garden area. If I move my mouse, can you see where I'm highlighting? Yeah. So we've got a market garden area with a polytunnel, about the same size as the one the guys are sitting in. Maybe slightly larger, but not very much. A shed and a yurt, and the shed is for washing and packing veg, and the yurt is for putting us up sometimes and putting woofers up, and also you know, a space where people can be in out of the weather, and if we have volunteers or we have education sessions going on, a place where we can do all of those things. And then there's a wildflower meadow and wetland area that borders the intensive market garden, and the rest of the field we intend to set up as a mixed fruit and nut permaculture orchard in lanes with chicken tractors running up and down the lanes. And so that everyone knows what I'm talking about, this little picture in the bottom right hand corner is trying to show what the basics of permaculture are. So it's about growing in layers. You have a top layer, which is your trees, then under that you grow shrubs, and under that you grow herbaceous perennials and herbs and onions, that sort of thing. And the important thing is that every single plant in that grouping is adding something. It is either something that is harvestable. It doesn't have to be food. It could also be wood and hazel for firewood, that sort of thing. It has to be harvestable, or it has to be contributing to the health of the other plants in its little grouping. So we may well have laburnum, which are those in Edinburgh. You see them all, they're very popular in Edinburgh. They're the great big bright yellow strings of flowers that hang down, and they fix nitrogen. So, and they also, of course, bring bees in and other pollinators. So not every plant has to be harvestable for us, but it has to contribute something. And then we can grow those in rows with a bit of grass in between them. And a chicken tractor is basically a chicken coop on a trailer. And they move up and down the rows every few days. The chickens always have fresh ground to explore. They keep pests down. They also weed a bit because they dig around the bottom of trees. And although they're in a slightly smaller area than ranging completely free, as far as the chickens are concerned, they are free range because every few days they get this new plot of land. And also as they go, they fertilize behind them, which fertilizes the trees and keeps the whole system going. And then the wildflower meadow is forming a low nutrient requirement buffer between the trees and the intensive market garden, because vegetables are kind of the Olympic athletes of plants. They need a lot of looking after, they need a lot of feeding, and so we need that little bit of a buffer between the trees, which will be quite hungry, and the market garden, which will be very, very hungry. And of course, at the same time, it's an ecosystem service, so it's bringing in wildlife, it's bringing in pollinators, and it's giving habitat to threatened species. So that's the current future plan for our site in Loch Tay. And I say current because, of course, the future is constantly changing. The future plan is constantly changing as we adapt and learn more about what we're doing. So this is what I walked into nearly 2 years ago now. The field that we're in is the one in the foreground, and it looks lovely, but it's a little bit of a lie. When that photo was taken, what had been sheep pasture for probably centuries actually had just been ploughed up and sowed with flowers, and you can see a bit of barley in the foreground for wild birds. So it looks as though it's really lush and it's okay soil, but actually it's quite depleted, it's very acidic. It's depleted of some things and it has too much of other things. It's very acidic. It's not as easy as it looks. And it is high altitude and it's quite exposed. But at the same time, we are on the north shore of Loch Tay, which means we're a south facing slope, which, you know, that helps. Above us, we have Ben Lawes, but you can see we also get a lot of weather. And our closest place where people live is Killin, which is, it's a village. And so what you may have noticed from those 3 photos, there aren't a lot of people in them. So although we have this 2.5 acres of field, we don't necessarily have a huge market. And that does impact how we choose to grow and how we choose to market our produce. So what it means is, although we could put that entire hectare-sized field down to potatoes, there aren't actually enough people around us to buy that many potatoes. It doesn't make sense for us to grow any one crop as a specialism. It makes much more sense for us to grow a very diverse variety of crops, because there are enough people around that if we can supply lots and lots of things that they're eating, that we can make the business sustainable. And then going from the other direction, the logical extent of specializing in any one product is what you see this is Almeria in Spain. And this is just polytunnels and greenhouses as far as the eye can see. And in fact, the only reason it isn't bigger is because it's bounded by those mountains. And so this is exactly the sort of growing we are trying to avoid. You see it across all of Perthshire. It's a chilly northern climate. It makes sense to cover your ground in polytunnels and extend your growing season if all you care about is growing the most peppers that you possibly can per unit area. And that's, you know, that is absolutely not what we want. There is no room for nature in that photograph that's up at the moment at all. And we want, yes, we want as much usable produce out of our small area as we can possibly get, but not at any cost. And we want to try, I am confident actually that in terms of yield, total yields of everything, all the biomass that we can take from our field, I'm confident that we can match these guys per unit area. But we're doing it by growing in layers, and we're doing it by increasing productivity by bringing nature in. So this is where I started, and I'll take you through what we've done over the last couple of years. So the first thing I did was put in a polytunnel, because we don't want to cover the field in plastic, but one polytunnel is very useful for extending the season and for propagation. So what I have found constantly is a balance that has to be struck, is that you can either choose between paying money and getting something done quickly, or doing it yourself slowly. And at the moment, we are not trading enough to be profitable. So we are still relying on income from funders. And so it tends to be a bit of a pendulum. If I get some funding in, I quickly rush and buy all of the things that I couldn't afford otherwise that are incredibly important, like the polytunnel. But then the money has run out. And so then we have to do everything by hand, the slow way, to finish the job. Once we've got the materials, we can build it ourselves, and we get there. So the polytunnel arrived, and we couldn't afford to have it put up for us. So that was quite the learning curve. A lorry arrived, it delivered pallets and pallets of polytunnel materials and 10,000 parts, all of which I had to understand, like the IKEA catalogue from hell. I had to understand what each and every part was and figure out how it all went together for an entire polytunnel. This is the irrigation system you're looking at. And I got that far, and then I got stuck, because we just couldn't get the ridgepole in. It was too dangerous. Those uprights don't have anything supporting them. It was swaying all over the place. And at that point, we had to call for help. But we did get the polytunnel up in the end. And then the first year, we just laid weed suppressant membrane down to try and keep stuff under control and start putting beds in. So we got the polytunnel in, and the strings that you can see across the bottom are the beginnings of the beds, because the original plan was that the market garden would be quite conventional. It would be standard 75 centimetre beds that you step over in rows, which is what you see most professional market gardens. That's the system they work to. That's what all the tools are set up for. And so that's what we did. And at the same time, we set up a small microgreen facility, and that's for sales to chefs. And that took a year, not because growing microgreens is difficult, but because figuring out how to grow microgreens at a scale that chefs are interested in reliably 365 days a year in Scotland, in a tiny greenhouse in someone's back garden, that's what took a year. It was figuring out those systems and processes for getting this to work reliably. But we're there now, and we're set. The microgreens are selling, and they're quite popular. And then at the same time, I was trying to set up the actual market garden, and so I just thought, well, let's put some plants in and see what happens. And I have to admit, nothing grew. It was a complete disaster. And I wasn't so naive that I thought everything was going to be fine, because I knew that there were problems with the soil, and I knew that it had been ploughed, which means that all of the soil structure had been damaged, and I knew that the plants were going to struggle. But I also knew that the only way to heal damaged soil is to grow in it. So I thought, well, let's put these in and let's see what happens. And honestly, nothing happened. It was a complete disaster. And there's some other issues that we had around propagation. We really didn't want to use plastic in our propagation. And so I was using fibre pots, but I'm pretty sure that the fibre pots, the way they're made, they probably have pesticide residue in them. And I think that for a lot of our first season, our seedlings were actually being stunted and killed by pesticide residue in the fibre pots that we were trying to grow them in. So that was a difficult problem to resolve and understand what was going on. And we lost a lot of time and a lot of plants to that. But, we persevered, and we've solved that problem, and now we can grow seedlings, and that is an important first step. So the other thing that you need if your soil is very damaged and nothing is growing is compost. So we went out and bought compost, and this is another one of those time versus money balancing acts. The first compost I bought was very, very good compost, and it was very expensive, and I couldn't afford very much of it. And then I realized that it also had peat in it as well. So not only was it expensive, it also wasn't sufficiently environmentally sound for what we wanted long term. But it was lovely compost. So then we tried municipal compost. And this is one of my favorite things that went wrong. I ordered 19 tons of compost, didn't really know what 19 tons of compost would look like because I had never seen 19 tons of compost in one place. Optimistically told the delivery driver that yeah, he'd be fine. He'd be able to back through the field gate and tip up his truck, and all of the compost would go in the field and it would be fine. And as always happens with delivery drivers, they phone you up when they're 10 minutes away to say they're coming now, and you aren't there because they didn't give you enough warning. So I wasn't there. By the time I arrived, 45 minutes later, the lorry had gone and the compost was all over the driveway and the entrance to the farm. And we share the farm. We have one field in a larger working farm. So obviously 19 tons of compost could not stay in the driveway at the entrance to the farm. But it didn't. You can see we got a JCB, we had a all-terrain vehicle and a trailer. The compost got moved. So that was compost number 2. And then this one, again, time versus money. This was very cheap compost. It's municipal compost. That means it's crap compost. You can see it's still steaming. It was still 70 degrees in the middle. So it's not ready for use. We couldn't put that on the field straight away. And in fact, it's still sitting in heaps by the market garden. It's about ready to use now. It needed at least another 6 months before it was in really good condition. And that's what you find. You can buy cheap compost or you can buy good compost, but you can't buy cheap, good compost. And if you buy cheap compost, you better be prepared to sit on it for a while. And then we had some real good luck. A neighbouring farmer was retiring and he had 20 years accumulation of sheep bedding that was beautifully well rotted, that he didn't need, he wasn't going to use. And this is barely 1/5 of it. This is a tiny proportion of the final amount. And we managed to get it all on the farm, again, with help from people with JCBs and big trailers. And it was a nightmare. We nearly tipped over one of the trailers, and this is a big agricultural trailer. But we now have enough compost on site, probably to keep us going for a few years. And that is incredibly important because compost, if you're growing without artificial fertilizers, compost, you just need so much of it. And now we have some. So that is one huge problem solved. So we started building beds. And as soon as we put the compost on the beds, we found a whole new load of problems. Animals walk over the compost, moles dig up the compost, voles live in the compost. And then we had winter storms that flipped pallets 20 feet across the garden onto our compost. But there are plants growing and they are healthy plants. And slowly but surely, we are starting to really make some good progress. So one of the first changes we made was to move away from straight lines to these hex beds. And we love the hex beds. We think they look attractive. And the main reason for doing it is we don't want to grow in straight lines. We don't want to grow monoculture, one plant at a time. We want to grow in these layers, like the permaculture layers that I showed at the beginning, but on a smaller scale in the polytunnel and in the beds. So the idea is that each of these beds will have larger plants in the middle and smaller ones to the edge, salads around the outside, but a real mixture of everything in every bed. And slowly but surely, we filled the polytunnel with more and more of these beds, and things started to grow and things started to do a bit better. And we got propagation set up and we moved away from growing in cardboard, and we don't love growing in plastic, but at the moment, it's all we can do. But don't look at the other side of the polytunnel because it's still a mess, but we are making progress. And we've started to get our first products out. So through the summer, we were able to make these lovely herb and flower salads, which were very popular. We grew some parsnips. I'm teasing. We did actually grow some good parsnips as well. The microgreens are doing really well. We can grow pea shoots now. We grew a sweet potato. Okay, that's the sweet potato. And we only grew one. But we are playing with all sorts of different fruit and veg and seeing how far we can push the boundaries of what you can grow in a highland farm in Scotland. And I think with a bit of practice, we might actually get some sweet potatoes that are saleable. We just need to do a bit better at it. This is Paula, by the way, my partner. And edible flowers, and we love growing the edible flowers because they just make the garden look lovely, but they also add so much to the produce. And, you know, cucumbers, French beans, don't adjust your screen. They're meant to be that colour, yellow crystal lemon cucumbers and yellow French beans. And towards the end of this summer, we were really starting to feel as though we're getting somewhere. And sweet peas, because they're a personal favourite of mine, and they bring in the pollinators, and who knows, maybe cut flowers is one of the diverse products that we'll also be selling. And we got chickens, and the chickens bring their own joys and their own problems. We lost chickens to predators. We had to move the chicken houses. We had to rebuild fences and secure fences. But we also learned how to raise chicks from 3 days old, which was enormous fun. And we got geese, and the geese are there to protect the chickens, which they sort of do. We built coops, we built a yurt platform, we built the polytunnel, as I've mentioned. So, you know, we've learned a lot, and we've had an awful lot of fun learning how to do things that we never would have thought 5 years ago either of us would have been doing. And of course, we've set up a neighbour food. And again, that was something that we'd planned to do, but didn't feel like we quite had the capacity to do it until COVID came along. And suddenly all of our hospitality customers disappeared, and our big next step that we'd been gearing up to, which was to start selling products to hotels, we couldn't do because all of the hotels had closed. And at the same time, supermarket shelves were empty, and it just made sense that now was the time, and it was time to start working on neighbour food. And we launched, and it's been absolutely fantastic, and it is still going strong, and we're very happy. And the chickens are laying eggs, and we've solved the problem of branding and packaging and how we're going to label things. And all these little things, they take time. You think up front, oh, I can just get some labels printed, but you have to design the label, and then you have to find the printer, and then you discover that a label, the cheapest you can find it is 30 pence per label. And when you're trying to compete with Tesco's, you can't afford to put 30 pence worth of packaging around your fruit and veg. But we've found this way of using stamps, which works really well on the egg boxes, works really well on paper bags, and where we do use plastic, we use the cellulose plastic, compostable plastic clamshells, and we can still use the stamps on plain labels, which are a lot cheaper. And it fits our personality, I think, the labels, the labeling that we've got. And so this is what the field looked like when I took this picture yesterday. And you can see the shed is almost finished. The polytunnel is finished. You can't see the yurt because it's out of the picture, but it's also should be going in this week. The platform is finished. You can see the geese. There are chickens around and about the place. And although we aren't measuring our success in kilograms of food produced today, I think in a year's time we will be, because almost all of our infrastructure and our really big upfront problems, like how do you build a bed? How do you grow a seedling? Where do you get compost from? How do you keep things clean and warm? And where do you store your tools? All of those big upfront problems as of now are just about solved. And so what we'll be doing all through this autumn and winter is creating all of those beds in the outside market garden, ready to really get growing in the coming spring. So this time next year, I think we will be measuring our success in yields and revenue rather than projects successfully completed. And of course, this is not one person's work. We've had an enormous amount of help. The farm have been so supportive. A lot of the people who live on the farm will just drop everything and get the JCB out and spend a whole day helping us move compost. We've had some fantastic funding support. Forth Environment Link, of course, have been brilliant. And the post office in Killin, who give us the space for our neighbour food market for free every week. And Saoirse 1875 are Scotland's first fully vegan hotel. And they buy £50 of produce from us every week, even though they don't necessarily need it, because they want to support us at this early stage so that, you know, in years to come, we'll be able to supply them with all sorts of wide variety of different things. And other growers, you know, this is the boot of Paula's car this spring, when we had missed the sowing date for all of the brassicas, but Blackhall Farm, a few miles away, they had seedlings left over. And both years that we've been growing, we've had leftover seedlings from Tomnahar and Blackhall, our two closest neighbours. And they have really helped, you know, to have, if you've missed a sowing date for something, to know that you're still going to be able to harvest it later in the season is tremendously important. And the hens, which get into everything. Every time we put a bed down, the hens dig it back up again. They think they're helping, they're not, but we wouldn't be without them.
Thank you so much, Ellie. Wow, there's so much in that. That's quite a journey you've been on, and thank you so much for sharing it with us. Quite a transformation. Look at that. So we've got 10 minutes or so. We can possibly go over a little bit as well if there are any questions. Well, I'll kick off. So one thing I think has struck me with both presentations we've had today, and thank you again to both of our growers for sharing their stories. One thing I think we've had in common is an attitude that where you haven't known how to do something or don't have an expertise in something, it's not stopped you just going for it, just starting and learning on the way and getting the help when you need it, and getting the help because people can see the enthusiasm and the gusto with which you're going for it. So I think you've both you've shown us how the problems you've had, and you've overcome challenges, and you've come at things from quite different angles. But the challenges don't just stop; they're there, and I'm just wondering what the key challenges are around sort of COVID or future other unrelated, maybe just to have a move away from COVID for a bit, but maybe any other unrelated challenges that you have coming, and how you think you might be able to overcome them. Perhaps I can throw you that to Sean and Steve first. So any kind of upcoming or current challenges?
As Ellie had mentioned, compost is a big one if you don't want to grow with fertilisers, so you really need to be bringing in as much as you can. We, when it was originally just the 2 tunnels, got in a decent practice of being able to do some green manuring over the winter to try and get some more nutrients back into the bed, and then bring in a little bit more once it got to closer to the start of the season. So that's always a recurring problem. As Steve mentioned, we've got a biochar project which is hopefully going to help that a little bit. But the typical problem, that without really mentioning COVID, is Brexit, because if there's food shortages through that, you really have to look at sustainable food produce, and even getting people to learn that you've got to get through these mistakes to get to the point where you want to go. I mean, as Ellie, I was laughing at her presentation because we fell through the same pitfalls most of the same times, but kids generally don't know where their food comes from. They just say Asda or Tesco's if you ask them, especially when we're dealing with primary schools. So again, trying to stop that cycle and get them into digging stuff and doing stuff and trying. Again, there's no real wrong answers, as long as you're willing to put the time in and commit, because you only really get one shot each season. But if you're willing to look at it as a multi-season venture, then you're generally going to be okay.
Yeah, and I would agree with a lot of that. I mean, these are really tough problems that we are trying to solve for. And if they were easy, we wouldn't be needing to do this. You know, they would have been solved. And one of the things that I learned fairly early on was, you know, funding cycles and growing cycles don't line up very well. And a lot of the social enterprise funding is set up for things like community cafes or bike share schemes that you can set up very quickly and see very quickly whether they're going to work or not. And so they're not so well set up for these sort of really ambitious multi-year programs, multi-year projects, where actually if you miss one growing season, you've lost a year, because you won't get that opportunity again for another 12 months. Yeah.
Any other questions from anything that you've heard today? So, Ellie, I'm desperate to ask you about tractors, but I'll restrain myself. But you kind of mentioned at the start of your presentation, obviously you're at the very early days of your journey and a couple of years behind Sean and Steve, who are relatively new themselves. But you mentioned you were coming at this from a point of view of developing maybe an exemplar project that ultimately will lead to jobs in the future, and that's something that the government are looking at, is obviously kind of resilience and I suppose food poverty prevention in some respects, at source by giving people jobs. So and I think our experience has been, you know, market gardens. We saw a huge demand for fresh produce during COVID. That meant market gardens, not just in Scotland, but right across the country and right across Europe, were really stretched and couldn't meet the demand that was there. So, what's your vision for those jobs in market gardens, and what needs to happen to help those outside of what you can do to help those jobs come along?
I think one of the fundamental things for me is that not everyone is passionate to the point of foolish obsession about producing food. And if we're going to move away from this very centralized, globalized, fragile system to something that is much more distributed and much more local, then we're going to need a lot more people growing. And if we limit the people who do that growing to the people who are so passionate about it that they'll do it to the exclusion of everything else, we probably don't have enough people to grow the food that we need. And so for me, one of the things we're trying to do with Scrumptious Garden is create a setup that people can do as a job. You know, it doesn't have to be your passion. We want it to be a living wage job that requires you to show up every day and want to work, and pretty much that's it. You don't have to have done, you know, horticultural study to master's level to make this work. And the tricky thing is that conventional growing, by which I mean, you know, crop rotations, monoculture, growing in rows, growing using mechanization to a certain extent, and following other people's instructions for what goes when at what time of year, that's relatively easy to teach, but it probably isn't resilient or productive enough. And what we're trying to build is something that's more resilient and productive, but by its very nature, it's more complex. So how do you mesh those two things? How do you take something that is very complex, but make it so that anyone can do it? And that's kind of what we're working on at the moment, is how you do that. And I think we're getting some of the way there. You know, there's things you can do, like put plants in, and these are not our ideas, these are coming, we're building always on the shoulders of the people before us, but you can group plants into their planting times of year, and then the instruction becomes very simple. It's always have the right plants on the bench, ready to go all year round. And then when something's finished, you take it out and you put something off a bench in, and that's it. That becomes the only instruction. And grow big things in the middle and small things at the front so that you can reach them more easily. And then you can start and build on it a bit by, you know, bearing in mind how things grow, observe how things grow, and make sure they you don't grow things that are incompatible with each other. But you know, that is what I think we need to do. We need to find a way to make what might be an intimidating way of growing accessible so that anyone can do it.
Thank you for that. And I think we're at the end of our time, so unless there are any last questions. No, in that case, I'm going to thank our speakers today, Sean and Stephen from Sustainable Thinking Scotland. Thank you so much for sharing your presentation there and your thoughts about how you're doing things in your community. It's absolutely fantastic, and I know we'll stay in touch. And Ellie at Scrumptious Garden there, thank you very much indeed for everything that you've shared there. Some really just absolutely packed presentations with so many useful nuggets of information there for anybody who wants to connect with their food and growing there. So just leaves it to me to say thank you again to our speakers. Thank you for coming along to this event and sharing with us today. The recorded version of this will go up onto our Forth Environment Link YouTube channel at some point in the future, so you can direct other people to it, and also look out for our social media channels for any upcoming events, and do kind of follow Forth Environment Link for news of other events. And that brings our week of Gather Around Local Food events to a close. It's been made possible with funding from Leader and Transport Scotland, so thank you again to our funders for everything that they've made possible with our project, and made it possible for us to support online markets around the country. So that's been absolutely fantastic. If you have any questions for us or any of our speakers, we can pass your questions on to them. If you don't have their details, we'll be delighted to do that. Otherwise, I'm going to say thank you very much again, and goodbye.
Thank you.